They say the mark of a truly prepared man isn't how he reacts when things go wrong. It's how quietly he smiles when they go exactly as he expected. Welcome back to Shadow Letters. Grab a cup of tea, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They just couldn't be bothered. Stay till the end, because this one has a moment at a kitchen table that I still think about on quiet mornings. The thing about being comfortable in life is that nobody believes it when you don't look the part. And I genuinely do not look the part. I drive a 2003 Holden Ute that my son-in-law once described, diplomatically, as having character. I wear a G-Shock watch I picked up at a Kmart in Townsville sometime around 2009. On most mornings, you'd find me in a faded flannel shirt and work boots, standing at the back fence of my property in the Hunter Valley, watching the cattle move across the paddock like they had somewhere important to be and weren't rushing to get there. I like that about cattle. They don't perform. My name is Dennis Bork. I'm 64 years old. For the past 26 years, I have owned and operated Bork Halcyon Agricultural Holdings, a mid-size agribusiness that most people in the industry know, even if most people outside it have never heard of. We run properties across 3 states. We supply feed grain to processing operations from Queensland to Victoria. We have a small logistics arm that moves refrigerated product up and down the eastern seaboard. Last financial year, we turned over a figure that would make your toast go cold if I said it out loud. But walk up to me on a Tuesday morning at the rural supplies store in Singleton, and you'd hand me a loyalty card, not a business card. That's not an accident. That's a choice I made a long time ago. My daughter Rosie and God gave me a good one when he gave me. Rosie did not inherit my preference for being unnoticed. And maybe Disley Felm Browns. She is warm and funny, and carries her mother's gift for filling a room the moment she walks into it. When she brought Kieran Stafford home for the first time about 4 years ago, I shook his hand, looked at him clearly, and thought, this man has spent his whole life being told he's exceptional. There's a particular posture that comes with that. Not arrogance exactly. More like a man who has never had to wait his turn and doesn't understand why anyone else does. Kieran wasn't a bad person. I made myself keep saying that because it was true and because it mattered. He was capable. He was focused. When I quietly had him looked at, yes, I had my daughter's boyfriend looked at. I am not remotely embarrassed about this. What I found was genuinely solid, sharp instincts, good numbers, a track record that held up under scrutiny. So when Rosie told me she was serious about him, I did something I hadn't done in 26 years of running operations. I let emotion into a business decision. I brought Kieran Stafford into Bork Halcyon as general manager of our logistics division. He had no idea who the actual owner was. As far as Kieran knew, he had been approached through an industry recruitment contact, had interviewed with our operations board, and had earned the position on merit, which, to be honest, he largely had. I just made sure the door was open when he walked past it. Rosie knew. She sat at my kitchen table the night I told her, with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and gave me a look that her mother used to give me when I'd done something that was either very smart or very stupid, and she hadn't decided which yet. Dad, she said, you know this is going to blow up eventually. Everything interesting eventually blows up, I told her. The question is whether you're the one holding the match or running from the fire. She didn't laugh. She shook her head slowly in the way that means she loves you and thinks you need supervising. For 18 months after that, things were fine. Kieran ran the logistics arm well. Better than well, actually. He found inefficiencies in our cold chain process that our previous manager had been papering over for years, and he fixed them without being asked, without fanfare, without trying to claim credit beyond what was due. I watched from a careful distance and found myself thinking that Rosie's judgment was considerably sharper than mine had been at her age. I wasn't ready to admit that to her face. but I filed it away. Then one evening in late autumn, I got a phone call. It was Kieran. He called me the way he always did. Respectful, warm, just slightly more formal than he needed to be. The way younger people sometimes are when they're talking to someone they think of as belonging to an older and simpler world. He told me his parents were coming down from Brisbane for a long weekend, and that they'd been hoping to sit down properly with me. He said they'd been asking about me for a while. There was something in the pause after that sentence, brief, barely noticeable, that sat in the wrong part of my chest. "They've been asking about you," he said. "For how long?" I asked. "Since before the wedding," he said. "They just never got the timing right." I almost said I was busy. My gut was making a noise I had learned over 64 years to take seriously. But there is a version of me, the version that got knocked down in 1996 by a partner who I trusted more than I should have, the version that spent 3 years rebuilding from actual nothing, that doesn't step back from a gut feeling. He steps towards it, hands in his pockets, pace slow and steady. "Sure," I said. "Just let me know where." The restaurant was in Newcastle, one of those places near the waterfront where the lighting is low and the menu is small and everything on it costs what a decent meal for 4 should cost, but you're only feeding 2. I wore a clean flannel shirt, my good boots, no tie because I don't own a tie I respect. Kieran met me at the entrance looking like an advertisement for a business magazine. Good jacket, fresh haircut, the kind of shoes that know what they cost. He looked at my shirt. To his genuine credit, he didn't do the thing some people do where they briefly look away. He just said, "You look good, Dennis." "I look like a man who remembered to wash his shirt," I said. He laughed. I didn't. Inside, his parents, Graham and Beverly Stafford, were already at the table. And here is something I want you to understand about people who are planning something. When you walk into a room they've prepared, they overcorrect. The welcome is too large. The warmth arrives a fraction of a second before it should, like they rehearsed the timing but not the instinct behind it. Graham Stafford stood up and extended his hand with the particular two-handed grip of a man who has decided to come across as sincere. He was maybe 68, well-dressed. The kind of tan you get from choosing to be outdoors rather than having to be. Beverly touched my arm when she shook my hand and said something about how she'd heard so much about me, more warmth in those 5 words than the situation called for. We ordered. We made the kind of small talk that happens at the beginning of dinners like this, where everyone knows the real conversation hasn't started yet and nobody wants to be the first to admit it. Graham asked about the Hunter Valley. I told him I ran a bit of land up that way. He nodded with the expression of a man who has categorized the answer and moved on. Kieran talked around the business the way he always did around me. Details kept deliberately vague because he thought he was being professionally courteous to a man he considered outside the industry. He mentioned the logistics contracts. He mentioned the new refrigeration arrangements he'd put in place. He was careful. He was respectful. And every time he glanced toward his father, something small and difficult moved across his face that I couldn't quite name yet. About 45 minutes in, somewhere between the main course arriving and the comfort I'd been cautiously building dissolving entirely, Graham Stafford reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the table. It was the kind of envelope that means something. Thick. Cream. The kind that doesn't come in a pack of 50 from the post office. He set it down with the deliberate gentleness of a man who wants you to understand that what's inside has weight. Then he folded both hands in front of him and gave me the smile of someone who believes they are holding the better cards. "Dennis," he said. His voice had dropped to the register people use when they are no longer pretending this is a casual dinner. "We've been wanting to have this conversation for some time. There are things about the history of Burke Halcyon and about what happened to a man named Warren Halcyon that I think you need to account for." I looked at the envelope. I looked at Graham. I looked at Kieran, who was looking at his water glass with the focused attention of a man desperately trying to be anywhere else. And I thought, there it is. 26 years of building. 26 years of carrying a name in that company that I had kept as a reminder rather than a tribute. 26 years of believing that what happened with Warren Halcyon was settled in the only place that mattered, the legal record, and my own conscience. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip of water, and set it down on the tablecloth with a quiet click. "Graham," I said, "before we go any further with that, there's something you should know about me." He smiled the patient smile of a man who has scripted this evening and trusts the script. "I'm listening," he said. I leaned forward slightly. I never sit down at a table I haven't already thought 3 moves past. The envelope sat between us like a grenade that someone had already pulled the pin on. And nobody at that table, not Graham, not Beverly, not even Kieran, had any idea which one of us was already standing outside the blast radius. I did not reach for the envelope immediately. That matters. Because the entire dynamic of a moment like that one depends on who moves first. Graham Stafford had invested what I imagined was a meaningful amount of time arranging this evening. The restaurant, the timing, the particular weight of that envelope placed just so on the white tablecloth. This was a production. Productions only work when the other cast members follow their cues. I had not learned my lines because I had not come here to perform. So I picked up my fork, cut a piece of the lamb on my plate, chewed it slowly. It was good. To be fair, 17 signs, properly seasoned, and I let the silence settle across that table, like a fifth person nobody had invited, but everyone could feel. Beverly shifted in her seat. Graham's patient expression developed a small tightness at the edges. Kieran still had not looked up from his water glass. After what I counted as a considered 40 seconds, I put my fork down, wiped my mouth, and reached for the envelope. Inside were documents, photocopied but organized the kind of neatness that says someone careful had been through them. I didn't read every word immediately. I didn't need to. The moment I saw the name at the top of the first page, my chest went cold and very, very calm at the same time. Warren Halcyon. Let me tell you about Warren Halcyon. In 1993, Warren and I were partners. We were 32 years old and we had the specific ambition of young men who have grown up with not much and have decided that's going to change. We started Halcyon Bork Pastoral out of a single leased property in the Upper Hunter, 200 head of Angus, a second-hand truck, and enough stubbornness between us to get through the first 3 years that would have finished most people. For 5 years, we built it together, and for 5 years I missed, or chose not to look at, every sign that Warren and I did not share the same understanding of what we were building. Warren was not a dishonest man by nature. I want to be accurate about this, because I have had a long time to think about it. He was a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that the rules were guidelines and that the people who got ahead were the ones who knew which guidelines to ignore. He had been borrowing against company assets without disclosure, not dramatically, not all at once, more the way a slow leak works, quiet and consistent, until the pressure has been bleeding out for so long that the system can't hold. By 1998, he had used company-held properties as collateral for a private loan to fund a separate land purchase in his wife's name, in a different state, using our client relationships and my word of mouth standing in the industry to smooth the path. When I found out, I was not loud about it. The anger that came was cold and focused, which is the only kind I find useful. I spent 4 months documenting every transaction, every collateral arrangement, every misdirection, and when I had built something that could not be argued with, I sat across from Warren, in the same leased office where we'd started, and gave him a simple choice. He could walk away, dissolve his interest, transfer his stake at fair value, and disappear cleanly. Or, I would take what I had to the authorities and let the process do what processes do. Warren Halcyon chose to walk away. I kept the Halcyon name in the company's new identity, not as a tribute and not as mockery. As a reminder, every time I saw it on a contract or a letterhead or a gate sign, it reminded me of exactly what careless trust costs. That memory has been worth more to me over 26 years than most of the strategic decisions I've made. What I did not know, what I had no way of knowing, because Warren had moved interstate and I had deliberately stopped tracking him, was that he had a brother-in-law, a man who had grown up hearing about the dissolution of that partnership from one side of it, a man who had never heard Warren say, with honesty, what actually happened. A man who had watched his wife's family carry a grievance for decades, who had married into that story as if it were fact, and who had decided somewhere along the way that someone needed to do something about it. Graham Stafford had married Warren Halcyon's sister 30 years ago. I looked up from the documents. Graham was watching me with the particular focus of a man who has been waiting for this moment and wants to make sure he doesn't miss the expression on your face when it arrives. Where did these come from? I asked, keeping my voice at a normal dinner volume. Warren kept his own records, Graham said. His version of events. What you did to him, Dennis. The way you forced him out. The way you took a business he'd helped build from the ground up and stripped him of it. His version? He passed away 2 years ago. Graham's voice held something underneath the strategy, now something quieter and more genuine. Heart attack. He died in a rental property in Rockhampton, with very little to show for 26 years of trying to start again. Because of what you took from him, and there it was. The grief underneath the agenda. And I want to be straight with you, I felt it. Not guilt, because guilt requires having done something wrong and I had not. But a quiet, honest ache for the version of that story that Graham believed was real. Because he had loved Warren's family for 30 years and had spent that time carrying a wound on their behalf. Graham, I said carefully, I'm sorry about Warren. Genuinely, I don't want your condolences. I know. What is it you want? He straightened slightly. What I want, he said, is for you to acknowledge what was done. A formal settlement to his family. The figure is in the envelope, and I want it handled before any of this becomes a matter that touches my son. My son. I looked at Kieran, who had finally looked up from the water glass. And what I saw on his face was not the face of a co-conspirator. This I want you to understand clearly, because it changes everything that comes after. What I saw was the face of a young man who had known that tonight's dinner had a purpose and had told himself the purpose was reasonable, right up until the moment he heard it said out loud across a white tablecloth in a restaurant, and now wasn't sure about anything at all. Kieran, I said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me directly. He met my eyes. How much of this did you know about before tonight? He exhaled once through his nose. He looked briefly at his father. Then he looked back at me. I knew there was a history, he said. Dad told me when Rosie and I got serious. He said there was something unresolved between your families and that he stopped. That what? I said. That me being close to you was an opportunity to address it. His voice was flat when he said it. Flat, in the way voices get when a person is keeping something very tightly controlled. Beverly reached across and put her hand over mine with a warmth so precisely calibrated I could practically hear the preparation behind it. Dennis, she said, this doesn't need to be adversarial. We're family now. We just want things to be put right. I looked at her hand on mine. I looked at her face. Then I looked at Graham, who was still holding the expression of a man who has played the first 3 moves of a chess game and is confident about the 4th. Beverly, I said pleasantly, thank you. And Graham, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm going to say next, because I'll only say it the once. I reached into the inside pocket of my own jacket and placed an envelope on the table beside his. Mine was smaller, plain white. the kind that doesn't announce itself. Warren's records, I said, are incomplete, which isn't surprising. A man constructing a version of events tends to keep only the pages that support his telling. What I have here are the original joint account statements from 1996 to 1998. The collateral arrangements, the loan documents registered against company property without board authorization, which at that time meant without my knowledge or consent. The correspondence, including a letter in which Warren explicitly outlined his plan to leverage our combined industry standing to support his private acquisition, and a statutory declaration from our accountant at the time, a woman named Patricia Ellery, who is 71 years old, in good health, and who processed those transactions on Warren's instruction, and has said so, in writing, with a solicitor, as witness. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Graham's expression changed. The confidence didn't collapse that would have been too clean. It receded, slowly, like tide going out and leaving the sand flat and exposed underneath. "You came here ready," he said. "I came here honest," I said. "There's a distinction." He pushed back slightly in his chair. His jaw was working. "You still forced him out," he said, but the certainty in his voice was gone, replaced by something that sounded more like a man trying to hold a position he's no longer sure of. "You gave him an ultimatum. I gave him a choice," I said. "The same choice the legal system would have given him, but without the public record, without the reputational damage, and at fair value. What he did with that choice was his own. What he chose to tell his family about it afterward was also his own." Graham Stafford had no answer for that. I watched something move across his face that I can only describe as the particular grief of a man who has spent years tending a story and has just found a crack in the foundation that he cannot repair by continuing to argue. Then Kieran spoke. He had been quiet for a full 3 minutes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet too, but it had an edge I had not heard in 18 months of working alongside him. "Dad," he said, "did you know all of this before you encouraged me to pursue the job?" Graham looked at his son. "I found out when Kieran told me the company name," he said. "I knew the Halcyon name." "When I told you the company name," Kieran repeated slowly. "Meaning, before Rosie and I got engaged, I was protecting this family. You positioned me," Kieran said. He said it the way people say things they have been thinking for a while and are saying for the first time, carefully, without drama. "You found out who I was working for and you saw a way in. You let me fall in love with Rosie. You kept this until the timing suited you." Graham tried the angle that fathers try when logical arguments have run out. "Kieran, everything I did was for what?" Kieran said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was costing him something. "Help you pressure my father-in-law over a story that he gestured toward my envelope apparently only had one side to it? That's not. You used Rosie," Kieran said. And Graham Stafford had nothing left to say to that. I stayed very still, because what was happening across that table was not mine to manage. A young man was seeing his father as a full and complicated person. For the first time, not just a father, but a man who had made choices, some of them poor ones, some of them dressed up in the language of family loyalty until they looked like something they weren't. The right thing to do in a moment like that is nothing. Bear witness. Don't fill the silence. After a long moment, Kieran turned to me. His face was composed in the way I had watched it compose itself before difficult operational conversations. A deliberate, professional steadiness that he wore like a well-fitted jacket. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You don't," I said. "I still sat at this table while my father put that envelope in front of you. I looked down at my plate and I let it happen." He paused. "That's not the kind of man I want to be." I held his gaze for a moment. "No," I said. "It isn't. And the fact that you can see that clearly tonight, under this much pressure, is the reason you still have a position to come back to on Monday morning. Something moved in his face. He didn't let it become relief, because he's not built that way. But it was there. Then I turned to Graham. He had the posture of a man who is lost and is deciding whether to keep pretending he hasn't. Those documents you brought tonight, I said, are one half of a story. On their own, in the context of what I've laid beside them, they establish nothing harmful to me and nothing actionable against anyone. I want you to understand that clearly. You came here tonight believing you had something. What you had was a framing without the frame. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I am not going to pursue anything regarding tonight, I continued. Not because I couldn't, and not because what you did is something I consider acceptable, but because Warren was your wife's brother, and you loved him. And people who love someone who is suffering tend to take on that suffering as their own, even when the story they've been given isn't accurate. I understand that, and I'm genuinely sorry that Warren carried what he carried, and that your family carried it alongside him. Beverly's eyes were wet. She was looking at the tablecloth and trying to be invisible. But I need you to hear the next part very clearly, I said. I leaned forward. Kieran is the general manager of my logistics division. In 3 months, when our internal restructure is complete, he will be stepping into the role of Chief Operating Officer of the full group. Rosie, as of her 30th birthday last year, holds a minority share position in Burke Halcyon. Your son has married into something that you spent months trying to leverage a piece of. And the only reason any of that remains available to him, and through him to your family's long-term well-being, is because he just demonstrated to me, in the last 15 minutes, that he is not the instrument you tried to make him. The silence after that sentence was the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. Graham Stafford placed his napkin carefully on the table beside his plate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stood, and Beverly stood with him. And they were quiet in the way people are quiet when all the prepared words have been used up and what's left is just the reality of what happened. He paused at Kieran's shoulder on the way past. Kieran, he said. I'll call you. Kieran kept his eyes on the table. I'll answer when I'm ready, he said. Not tonight, Dad. When I'm ready. I watched Graham and Beverly Stafford walk out of that restaurant, and I felt nothing theatrical about it. Just the quiet, settled weight of something that had been unresolved for a long time finally arriving at a proper resting place. Kieran and I sat with the 2 envelopes and the remains of our meals and the particular quiet of a room after a storm has moved through it. The waiter appeared, bless him. He had the timing of a man who had assessed the table from across the room and decided the weather had cleared. Anything else for you both? He asked. Kieran looked at me. I looked at Kieran. Dessert? I asked. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been waiting since the entree. Yeah, he said. I think we've earned it. We ordered the sticky date pudding because this is Australia, and that is the correct choice, and anyone who disagrees is wrong about most things. The waiter disappeared. The restaurant settled back into itself around us. After a while, Kieran looked at me with the directness he uses when he wants to say something real. Dennis, he said, I need to ask you something. Go on. Did you set any of this up? The job, the timing, all of it was there, a test involved that I wasn't aware of? I considered the question the way it deserved. When you came into the logistics role, I said, you found that we'd been losing roughly $800,000 a year to inefficiencies in our cold chain scheduling. Inefficiencies that the previous manager had been patching over with workarounds that cost us more than the original problem. You identified it in your first 3 months. You built a solution. You presented it to the operations board before I knew there was an issue. You didn't ask for recognition. You just fixed it because it needed fixing. He nodded slowly. That's not a test result, I said. That's character. And no, I didn't set that up. He was quiet for a moment. I need to ask you something else, he said. Ask. Rosie, does she know everything about tonight? About what my father had planned? She knows her father can read a room, I said. She knows I don't go to dinners unprepared. The details of tonight are yours to tell her. That conversation belongs to you two. But I'll tell you this, that woman did not marry you because of who your father is. She married you because of who you are when nobody's watching. Tonight you showed me you're the same person then too. He was quiet for a while after that. When the puddings arrived, they were very good. Properly warm, good toffee sauce. The kind that makes you briefly stop thinking about everything that's happened in the last hour and a half, and just be present in the fact of a good pudding. I made a note to tip well on the way out. I drove home to the Hunter Valley in the dark in my 2003 Holden Ute with the window down and the autumn air coming in off the paddocks smelling of dry grass and distant rain. The valley was quiet and the stars were doing what they always do out here, which is remind you that most of what you spend your time worrying about is fairly small in the grand scheme. I thought about Warren Halcyon, the young man he was before he started making choices that compounded in the wrong direction. I thought about Graham Stafford sitting somewhere tonight with a story he'd have to decide what to do with, whether to carry it forward, still shaped like a grievance, or whether to finally put it down and let the weight go. I thought about Kieran driving home to Rosie, trying to find the words to explain an evening that had rearranged his understanding of his own history. And I thought about what it means to build something, not just a company, a way of moving through the world that means when something comes for you and something always eventually comes for you, you are not caught surprised. You are already home. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the ute for a minute. My house was lit from the inside because Rosie had been by earlier and, like her mother before her, has never once remembered to turn off the kitchen light on the way out. My phone buzzed. It was Kieran. A text message. Short. Told Rosie. She says you're impossible, and she's not surprised, and she loves you. Also, she says the flannel shirt thing has to stop at some point. I smiled at the phone in the dark and typed back. The flannel built the paddock she grew up on. Then I got out of the ute, walked up to my front door, and went inside to make a cup of tea. Somewhere across the city, Graham Stafford was sitting with an incomplete story and the slow, uncomfortable work of re-examining it, and I was home, with my cattle on the hill and my kitchen light still on, and a daughter who married a man who, when it mattered, chose to be better than the situation he'd been placed in. Some men build things to prove a point. I built mine to protect something worth protecting. There's a real difference between those two motivations. And if you're building anything in your life right now, a business, a family, a reputation, I'd ask you to sit with that difference for a while, because the things we build from fear or pride tend to demand constant maintenance. But the things we build from love and quiet purpose, those stand on their own. They don't ask anything of you, except that you keep showing up with honesty. That's what Warren Halcyon never understood. He built to get ahead of someone. I built to have something worth leaving behind. 30 years later, the difference between those two intentions was sitting right there on a white tablecloth in Newcastle. As plain as anything. Protect what matters. Build for the long run. And when someone comes to the table with a story they believe is true before you decide how to respond, make sure you know the whole of it, because incomplete stories are the source of most of the damage people do to each other in this life. Not malice, not cruelty, just half a truth, carried too long, passed down too many times, until it hardens into something that feels like fact. Warren's half-truth cost him everything. It cost Graham years of misplaced loyalty. It nearly cost Kieran his integrity. Don't let someone else's half-truth cost you yours. That's all from Shadow Letters this week. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.